My next question tonight is on the guitar's popularity, ebb and flow, or Chris, as you've described it, peaks and lows. Let's start with the Renaissance guitar in the 16th century. It was very popular. Queen Elizabeth I, you just mentioned a moment ago, received on New Year's Day 3 guitars in 1559. So there was sort of a guitar craze, perhaps. More curious is how did that end and why did that end? And you reference a couple poems and a play where it was referred to as an ancient guitar and an old guitar by the beginning of the next century, and so it fell out around 1600 or so. And why is that, do you suppose?
Well, I suppose one way to look at this whole history, and I'd actually like to bat this question across to my friend James in a moment, actually, is that it seems to me, I mean, the guitar is not, if I don't sound treacherous, the guitar is not an instrument of inexhaustible resources. I mean, it has certain horizons, and you can change those horizons in various ways, I suppose, and rejuvenate the instrument when people feel that its possibilities have been exhausted. I mean, working out why something becomes unfashionable, this is difficult perhaps often as to work out why it becomes fashionable. But what I'd like to ask James, who has, of course, such a wide-ranging knowledge of how guitars were built, how far do you think the ebb and flow of the guitar's fortunes is due to changes in its musical capacity, things that you actually do to the guitar in technical terms to make it able to do different things?
And let me add to that, and challenges from other instruments, perhaps,
yes,
that were as popular.
I was going to say that, the external influence, you know, when, like, for example, late 19th century and the piano become very popular, you know, that, so it's not necessarily a fault with the guitar, it's just other instruments growing up around it. And also, sometimes people say, you know, the guitar's gone out of fashion, where it's, you know, sometimes it was actually more popular. It's just that the, you know, it wasn't popular perhaps as a solo instrument, but used within sort of guitar, mandolin, banjo orchestras, and they were actually being played a lot more.
But how far do you feel, for example, the change from double strings to single strings, or the addition of a sixth string, or the beginnings of overspun strings so you get a richer bass? I mean, how far do you feel that those innovations are ways of, as it were, carrying the guitar back up to a peak from the trough?
Well, I think people would like to think, you know, when you add a string or that, then it's you're taking it forward. But it's difficult to say, I think, looking at the actual instruments, but perhaps looking at the methods is another way of doing it. How many methods were published in a particular time, whether there were more published in, you know, as 5-course instruments or 6 single strings.
But coming back to this ebb and flow of the guitar and the popularity, let's hope, or let's imagine at least, that there were always
popularity on some level.
Popularity
Yes.
on some level, because the guitar in many ways is a very simple, easy instrument to learn some basic chords and for accompanying songs in particular. So I assume that all through the history of the guitar, and then I have to ask you, who are a specialist in the earlier guitar, that the guitar must have been basically used for accompanying songs in the early times as well.
Yes, but I think James makes an extremely good point that when we think of the guitar being in a trough, what could actually be happening is that there is nobody noticing what's going on because it doesn't conform to certain expectations. I mean, I was rather under the impression, for example, that in England in the Victorian period, the later 19th century, that nothing much was happening. And then I started looking at the newspapers and found just hundreds upon hundreds of little concerts being given by local amateur musicians, often for charitable purposes, in parish halls, in schoolrooms, even in small villages in rural counties like Devonshire. There's an enormous amount going on that I hadn't suspected. So I think James makes a very good point, that it's not that it falls necessarily out of fashion. Well, it ceases to be used by the people who dictate what fashion is. But it remains, as Eric says, it remains just somehow unprominent and unnoticed, but still there.
Right.
It seems to be a survivor.
Yeah.
Exactly. So many times that commentators have sort of predicted that the guitar, its final demise is going to be like the lute to be extinct, but it seems to have always survived.
And speaking on that, I'm going to add to this, and I want to get your opinion. Speaking of the lute, the writer Pierre Trichet wrote in 1646, and I think you would know better than I, of course, that this was a resurgence in popularity. It was beginning in the 1650s or so. And the guitar or guitarne is a musical instrument used by the French and Italians, but even more by the Spanish, who were the first to make it fashionable. Nevertheless, one can find in France courtiers and ladies who try like monkeys to imitate the Spaniards, showing clearly that they enjoy foreign things more than natural and domestic ones. Because who does not know that the lute is the proper and familiar instrument for French people, and that it is the most pleasant of all musical instruments? In any case, some people from our nation abandoned it completely to adopt and learn guitar playing. Isn't it because it is easier to play well than the lute? Maybe that was the reason. So let's talk about the Baroque lute for a moment. What was entailed? How many strings there? Of course.
Well, yeah, some people think it its own demise by adding more and more strings till it become unwieldy and impossible to play.
Yes, yes. The lute develops a sort of elephantiasis in the 18th century and finally just gives up the struggle.
Yeah.
But well, I mean, the passage that you cite there, Jeff, I mean, does identify. I don't know if my colleagues agree, but I mean something very important in the appeal of the guitar, that everywhere except Spain it's regarded as foreign. I don't think the Spaniards have ever regarded the guitar as foreign in any way, but everyone else has. There's always a sense that the guitar is somehow slightly, little bit, untrustworthy, a bit dangerous, a foreigner, a stranger, but all the more alluring for that. But would you say that it has that quality?
Absolutely, and I think that when we talk about, and we'll get to it in a moment here, the next big craze of guitar, the late 18th century going to the early 19th century, as you've written on it and given lectures upon it, it's the sort of mystical, romantic aspect of guitar and the music for it gave it certainly kind of a foreign attraction. What do you say that no significant Baroque composer wrote for the guitar? Is there, other than Corbetta, who is, but he's not we're not talking Bach, or Handel. So why was that left out, do you suppose?
But it's the same throughout the history until the 20th century. That no real composer
so there was no difference, really. Okay.
For the guitar, and there may be many reasons, but one is particularly with the Baroque guitar, I suppose, that the idiosyncrasy in a way of the tuning, the stringing. You have to be a player in order to be able to write properly for it. And again, and why are there no composers later on also? It's partly the same, but partly also that going back to the idea that the guitar is sort of a little not highbrow instrument, never was considered, like what you just said in comparison to the lute. So,
Always played second fiddle, no pun intended.
Exactly, not even the second fiddle.
Let's talk about the second half of the 17th century, though, in Corbetta, at Whitehall, in England. And it was sort of a guitar craze, a resurgence then, would you say?
Yes, well, just as the French forget that the British beheaded a king before they did, Americans may sometimes forget that we were once a republic. And the English Republic ended in 1660 with the return of Charles II and the end of the Cromwellian regime. And though guitars were found in England under Cromwell, it was really the return of Charles II from France, who brought a guitar with him, which he bought in Paris. That really created a court fashion for the guitar in Great Britain. And Charles was able, it's surprising in a way, but he was able to bring over with him Francesco Corbetta, who by any standards was perhaps the most famous European player of the day and was called, the best of all, El Mejor de Todos, by, I think, Gaspar Sanz. So this was, for 20 years, this extraordinary Italian guitarist was actually employed in Whitehall, in Westminster. And that created a very considerable court vogue. Women played it, and there are a number of portraits, often very seductive portraits, of course, because this is a court with a very sexualized atmosphere. a number of voluptuous court portraits of women playing guitars. But the king played it, and indeed the king after him played it, and they had the extraordinary model of this great European virtuoso to at least show them how it could be done. There is a story in Pepys's diary, Samuel Pepys being perhaps the most famous diarist in the English language, how one day he went to visit the future king, James, who was the head of the Navy, and Pepys was a naval official. And when he arrived at St James's Palace, which still stands, early in the morning to see James, Corbetta was there. And Corbetta played for Pepys. I take it that, in fact, that Corbetta was going to go in and play while James, the future king, was getting dressed. This would be his levee in the morning. And Corbetta played for Pepys. And Pepys said something which is curiously reminiscent of things that are said at later periods of the guitar, and I think Eric and James will both recognise the sentiment. He played very well, said Pepys, but I was sorry to see so much ingenuity lavished upon so wretched an instrument.
Yeah, that's a problem.
It's repeated a lot.
It's repeated throughout history.
I'm going to ask then, once again, we have a fade on the guitar after, I guess, Queen Anne passed away. And there was maybe a 40 or 50 year gap there. In England, I guess it was the cittern became popular. But what happened in that 30 or 40 years of from 1700 to 1750, it appears that, if I'm not mistaken, the guitar sort of fell out of popularity a bit. Is that a fair assessment?
I think
Which country?
so. Well, generally in Europe. But how about wars and the general situation in Europe at that time? I'm not sure.
I think Eric's right, but it picks up in France in mid-century.
In mid-century, definitely. Once
Yeah.
you get to 1750s,
Right.
then
But the
something new.
1700s, the first half of the century is a very thin time.
Yeah.
It's very hard to find good material for that period, I think, anywhere in Europe, maybe outside Spain, or maybe even Spain, if I knew the material better.
So let's pick up then. So we have an acknowledgement here that the guitar waned a bit in the first part of the 18th century.
Yes.
But Chris, I'm going to quote from a page out of one of your books. In 1597, Thomas Morley had declared that one kind of repertory associated elsewhere with the guitar was merely a form of clownish music. But you go on to say, perhaps it was sometimes so, but the history of the guitar in the early 19th century, like Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, shows how a stage may empty, leaving only the clown behind.
Oh, damn fine piece of writing that was.
I was impressed.
I wrote it for you, didn't I?
So we have this guitar renaissance begins in the late 18th century. So what resurrected the guitar's popularity in the late 18th century into the early 19th century? What was that about?
Well, I would ask James about the technical changes that occurred in the
Because
second
a lot
half of the
happened.
century.
I mean, we went. That was, I guess, a time we went through courses to single strings.
Yeah.
But it started, sorry to interrupt, it started in France before the change of the instrument, in a way, where it was still basically the Baroque guitar with 5 double strings in the 1750s and 60s, and only from there on they slowly, gradually started to use single strings, and and it was really a vogue for the guitar, or for singing with guitar accompaniment, we should say, in France at that time, in the second half of the 18th century.
Yeah, it's a resurgence, I suspect, of a particular kind of repertoire, which was not itself new in the mid-century, vaudeville and so on, but light songs, often with a pastoral setting, with a kind of affected innocence and courtliness, had been around for a long time. But clearly, as Eric suggests, there's a vogue for using the guitar to accompany them. And that is explicitly what is said in the Encyclopédie, the great monument of French Enlightenment thought. There is an item, an entry in this encyclopedia for the guitar, and it says some have helped it to become reborn by using it to accompany brunette, pastorelle, vaudeville, very simple songs with a pastoral setting. It's a particular kind of repertoire that the guitar becomes associated with that lifts it back up, I think.
But it's an interesting time, if I may throw this out to you to run with. You have sort of plainer looking 5-course Baroque guitars during this time, but you also have an overlap period where the 6-string individual string guitar happens. So for example, my collection, I have a a six-string Fabricatori guitar from 1785 that predates a Vieux-Muiron guitar from the 1790s. And there's I have a Lambert, I think, also that's right close to the Fabricatori six-string guitar. So music must have been written for both, or were they played on both?
Sometimes it's difficult to know what came first, the music or the instrument. But Eric touched on that because you know, the guitar was involved in a way, you know, so they were using the same instruments and they were able to take some strings off from, you know, 5 courses to 5 single strings, and then just perhaps adapt the head so it took 6 single strings. So you might have just had a brief time with these sort of instruments before the makers actually started to build 6 single-string guitars.
So you could use it either way, if you will.
Yeah,
Okay.
and there's an example in England, isn't there? I think I sort of found in my research the citterns you spoke about in England, the so-called English guitar that was tuned to a C major chord.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time the 6 single string came into England, they were also using the same music, but making guitars which were Spanish guitar shaped, but tuned to a C major chord.
Oh, really?
So there's sort of stepping stone.
Uh-huh.
So they had a Spanish-looking guitar, but they were still using the music that was around them, that was used for the English guitar. Before then, they went on to write proper Spanish 6 single-string guitar music.
And I know in England, they refer to the new 6-string guitar as the Spanish guitar, even, I suppose. Was that ubiquitous throughout Europe? Or
Well, it wasn't a new use of the term, was it?
Okay.
No, I mean, there are references to guitare en espagnol in French literature as early as the 1530s.
Okay.
But I think Spanish guitar, as far as I know, amongst the European languages now, it's virtually only English that, you know,
Call it that?
Yeah, I mean, the
Okay.
French wouldn't say that, or the Germans, as far as I know. Certainly not, of course, the Spanish.
Coming back to this transition from double course to single and to 6-string can be followed in many ways in France, because we can see it from the guitar methods they published and what they recommended. And in France, as I said, it was a real vogue for the guitar in the second half of the 18th century. And literally between 1757 and 1800, there were at least 25 guitar methods published in Paris at that time, and by different authors. And they started off with saying the guitar has 5 double strings, and then at some stage somebody said no, the guitar should only have single strings, 5, still 5. And then at the end of this period, you see that they started to recommend, some started recommending 6 single strings, whereas others were conservative and kept to the 5-string. And some published music, like, for example, Doisy, who went into also authored the method in 1801. And he says in his method he prefers to play on a 5-string guitar, but I realized that many people now use 6-string guitars, so I put an 8 sign on the bass notes that can be played on the 6-string for those who play a 6-string instrument.
So we can sell more copies of his music.
Yeah, that's right.
Of course, that's part of it. But
okay, go ahead. I'm
it's
sorry.
interesting what you said about the 1785 guitar, because it may be, but this you know more about that they developed single string, 6-string guitars earlier than in France.